Sarah Carter sat in the dim light of a modest living room, her hands trembling over the swell of her 3-month pregnancy. The air was thick with tension as her husband, Major Edward Carter, stood before her, his military uniform crisp, his voice steady but cold. "Sarah, I need you to agree to a divorce," he said, his eyes avoiding hers. "It's just temporary, I swear. Emily Moore, my brother David's widow, is pregnant and alone. She has no one. I'll take her with my unit, care for her and her baby, and once she's settled, I'll return to you. We'll remarry." His words were smooth and rehearsed, but cut like a blade through Sarah's heart. In her past life, Sarah had been naive, clinging to the fragile threads of her marriage with desperate hope. She loved Edward, believed in his honor as a soldier, and trusted his promises. The idea of divorce, even a temporary one, shattered her. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, Edward, I can't lose you. We're having a baby." "How can you ask this?" Her refusal marked the beginning of her downfall, a spiral into despair that would consume her. Emily Moore, the widowed sister-in-law, catalyzed Sarah's ruin. The consequences were catastrophic when Sarah's rejection pushed Edward to prioritize Emily. Emily, unable to join Edward's unit, sought an abortion to free herself from the burden of single motherhood. But the procedure went wrong. In a small, understaffed clinic, Emily hemorrhaged, her life slipping away along with her unborn child. The news reached Edward, and his grief twisted into a venomous hatred for Sarah. He blamed her for Emily's death, convinced her stubbornness had driven Emily to that desperate choice. Edward's rage was unrelenting. By the time Sarah was 6 months pregnant, her world had crumbled. Edward, consumed by vengeance, orchestrated a cruel betrayal. One night, he burst into their home with a group of his comrades, their faces twisted with disgust. They found Sarah in bed with Sam Tucker, a local thug known for his violent reputation. The scene was a setup, a meticulously planned frame, but Sarah, dazed and disoriented, couldn't prove her innocence. The scandal spread like wildfire. Neighbors whispered, friends turned away, and Sarah's name became synonymous with shame. Divorced and disgraced, Sarah was sentenced to labor reform, exiled to a brutal camp far from home. The conditions were inhumane, grueling work under a merciless sun, meager rations, and no mercy for her advancing pregnancy. At 8 months, exhaustion and overwork triggered premature labor. Alone on a dirt floor, surrounded by indifferent guards, Sarah endured a birth that was more agony than miracle. Her baby, a fragile boy, drew only a few weak breaths before slipping away. Sarah, bleeding and broken, followed soon after, her final moments filled with a crushing despair that seared itself into her soul. As her vision faded, she cursed Edward's betrayal, her heart heavy with regret for her blind trust. Yet, in that darkness, something stirred, a flicker of light, a whisper of possibility. Sarah's consciousness lingered, caught in a liminal space where time seemed to pause. A radiant figure appeared in her mind's eye, its voice soft but resolute. "Your story isn't over, Sarah. You've suffered enough. Rewrite your fate." The words echoed, filling her with a strange, unshakable certainty. Was it a divine gift, a cosmic second chance, or merely the defiance of her unyielding spirit? She didn't know, but the pain of her past life burned too fiercely to ignore. She would not repeat her mistakes. When Sarah opened her eyes, she was back in that same living room, Edward's voice repeating his divorce request. The clock on the wall ticked the same hour, the air carried the same weight, but Sarah was no longer the woman she had been. Her heart, once soft and trusting, was now a fortress, her resolve sharpened by the memory of her and her baby's deaths. The radiant figure's words echoed in her mind, a guiding star in the storm of her grief. She would not cling to Edward's lies. She would not let his betrayal destroy her again. This time, Sarah Carter would fight, not for love, but for justice. Her hands steadied, no longer trembling. She looked at Edward, his face expectant, confident she would crumble as she had before. But Sarah's eyes were clear, her voice firm. "Fine, Edward, let's get a divorce. But I have one condition, $500 for child support. Our baby deserves that much." The words were a declaration, a line drawn in the sand. Edward blinked, caught off guard by her composure, but nodded quickly, eager to be free of her. As they left for the Civil Affairs Bureau, Sarah clutched the divorce certificate, her heart pounding not with fear but with purpose. The tragedy of her past life was over. Now, she would write a new story of vengeance, redemption, and a life reclaimed. Sarah Carter's world dissolved into a haze of pain and darkness as her life slipped away in the labor camp, her unborn son's faint cries echoing in her final moments. The despair was absolute, a weight that crushed her soul. Yet in that void, a spark flickered. A radiant figure, cloaked in shimmering light, appeared in her mind's eye. Its voice, soft yet commanding, pierced the silence. Sarah, your story isn't finished. You've endured betrayal, loss, and cruelty. Now rewrite your fate. The words weren't just a promise, but a fire igniting something fierce within her. Was this a divine intervention, a cosmic gift, or the defiant will of her spirit refusing to break? Sarah didn't know, but the vision anchored her, a beacon in the storm of her grief. Her eyes snapped open, and she was no longer in the camp. The familiar scent of her living room, faint lavender and worn wood, filled her senses. She sat on the same threadbare sofa, her hands resting on the gentle curve of her 3-month pregnancy. Across from her stood Edward Carter, her husband, his military uniform pristine, his face a mask of calculated sincerity. "Sarah, I need you to agree to a divorce," he said, his voice steady but laced with impatience. "It's temporary, I promise. Emily Moore, David's widow, is pregnant and has no one. I'll take her with my unit, care for her and her baby, and then we'll remarry." The words were identical to those from her past life, each syllable a dagger she'd once let pierce her heart. In her previous life, Sarah had crumbled, pleading with Edward to stay, her love blinding her to his deceit. That naivety led to her ruin, Emily's death, Edward's betrayal, and her tragic end. But now, the memory of her baby's fleeting breaths and the radiant figure's command burned in her chest. She wasn't that Sarah anymore. Her heart, once soft and trusting, had hardened into resolve. She wouldn't beg, wouldn't cling. This was her second chance, and she would seize it with both hands, not to salvage a broken marriage, but to dismantle the lies that had destroyed her. Sarah's gaze met Edward's, her eyes clear, unflinching. "Fine, Edward," she said, her voice calm but edged with steel. "I agree to the divorce, but I have one condition, $500 for child support. Our baby deserves that, even if you don't." The demand caught Edward off guard. His brow furrowed, expecting tears or resistance, not this quiet defiance. For a moment his mask slipped, revealing a flicker of unease, but he quickly nodded. "Of course, Sarah. Whatever you need." His agreement was too swift, too eager, betraying his relief at her compliance. He thought her acquiescence meant weakness, but Sarah saw through him. She knew his promises were empty, his devotion to Emily a secret he believed hidden. They left for the Civil Affairs Bureau, the morning sun casting long shadows on the dusty streets. Sarah's steps were steady, her mind racing with the weight of her rebirth. The radiant figure's words echoed, "Rewrite your fate." Was it real, or a desperate hallucination born of her dying moments? It didn't matter. The clarity it brought was undeniable, sharpening her focus. She felt the divorce certificate in her hand before they even reached the bureau, its imagined weight symbolizing her liberation. The process was swift inside, papers signed, stamps pressed, and a clerk's monotone voice declaring their marriage dissolved. Edward's face softened as he handed her the $500, his relief palpable. "Sarah, don't worry," he said, his tone gentler now, almost patronizing. "This is just temporary. Once Emily's settled, I'll come back. We'll be a family again." Sarah's lips twitched, not with a smile, but with a cold, mocking edge she hid from him. She'd believed those words in her past life, clinging to them like a lifeline. Now, they were ash in her mouth. She knew the truth. Edward's affair with Emily, his ruthless schemes, his willingness to sacrifice her and their child for his lover. His promise was a lie, and she wanted no part of it. "Don't make promises you can't keep, Edward," she said, her voice low, her eyes locked on his. He flinched, a shadow of guilt crossing his face, but she turned away, clutching the divorce certificate tightly. It wasn't just a document. It was her first victory, a severance of the chains that had bound her to his betrayal. As they stepped outside, the world felt sharper, more vivid. The breeze carried the scent of blooming jasmine, a stark contrast to the storm within her. Sarah's heart ached, not for Edward, but for the woman she'd been, the one who'd loved so unquestioningly. That Sarah was gone, buried with her son in a past she'd never repeat. Yet the weight of her loss lingered, a quiet grief she carried alongside her resolve. She glanced at Edward, who was already looking toward his jeep, where Emily waited, her silhouette smug and expectant. Sarah's fingers tightened around the $500, her mind shifting from grief to strategy. This money was her lifeline, a tool to build a future free of Edward's shadow. Emily's presence was a taunt, a reminder of the battle ahead. Sarah knew Emily's charm, manipulative allure, and the men she'd ensnared, including Edward. In her past life, Sarah's warnings about Emily's infidelity had fallen on deaf ears, but now she saw her chance. She wouldn't just escape Edward and Emily, she'd expose them, let their deceit destroy them. As Edward hurried to Emily's side, ignoring Sarah, she felt a surge of determination. The radiant figure's voice whispered again, "Rewrite your fate." This was no dream, it was her mandate. Sarah Carter was reborn, and she would write a story not of tragedy, but of triumph, her every step a defiance of the past that had broken her. Sarah Carter stood outside the Civil Affairs Bureau, the divorce certificate crisp in her hand, its ink a silent testament to her newfound freedom. The morning sun burned bright, but a chill lingered in her heart, not from the loss of Edward, but from the weight of truths she now carried. In her past life she had been blind, and her love for Edward was a veil that obscured his betrayal. She had believed his promises, trusted his honor, and paid the ultimate price, her life and her unborn sons. Now, reborn with the clarity of that radiant figure's command, Sarah saw Edward for what he was, a liar, a manipulator, and a man consumed by his illicit love for Emily Moore. Edward's voice still echoed in her mind, his false promise to remarry her after settling Emily and her baby. Those words had been her lifeline in her previous life, a desperate hope she clung to until it drowned her. Now they were a mockery, each syllable laced with deceit. Sarah knew the truth, a truth she'd been too naive to see before. Edward wasn't just helping his widowed sister-in-law out of duty, he was her lover, convinced the child in Emily's belly was his own. The revelation had come too late in her past life, whispered in fragments by neighbors after her disgrace. But in this life, Sarah's eyes were wide open, sharpened by the pain of her death, and the radiant figure's call to rewrite her fate. As she walked away from the bureau, Edward's jeep roared to life behind her, Emily's silhouette visible in the passenger seat. Sarah's stomach twisted, not with jealousy, but with a quiet fury. Emily Moore was no grieving widow, no innocent in need of Edward's protection. She was a predator, her beauty a weapon she wielded with precision. Sarah remembered the days she'd lived with Emily, when David, Edward's younger brother, was still alive. Emily's laughter had filled their home, but it was never for David. Men flocked to her, suitors before her marriage, admirers after, drawn by her coy smiles and calculated charm. Sarah had seen them, late at night, slipping into the house when David was away, their shadows betraying Emily's infidelity. One memory burned brightest, a night when Sarah, unable to sleep, had crept downstairs and caught Emily with a man who wasn't David. Their whispers were intimate, their touches brazen, and Sarah, too timid then, had retreated, convincing herself it was a mistake. She'd tried to warn Edward after David's death, when he announced his plan to care for Emily and her unborn child. "Edward, that baby might not be David's," she'd said, her voice trembling. "Emily, she's not who you think." But Edward had scoffed, his face twisting with scorn. "You're jealous, Sarah. Stop slandering her. She's family." His refusal to listen had stung, but now Sarah understood why. Edward wasn't defending Emily's honor. He was protecting his secret, his affair with her a bond he cherished above his marriage. The depth of Edward's betrayal settled over Sarah like a heavy fog. He hadn't just cheated, he'd orchestrated her destruction to avenge Emily's death in her past life, framing her with Sam Tucker, condemning her to the labor camp where she and her son perished. The memory of that betrayal, of Edward's cold eyes as he led the mob to her bedroom, ignited a fire in her chest. She stopped walking, her breath catching as she pressed a hand to her belly. Her baby, the one she'd lost, deserved better than a father who'd sacrificed them both for a lie. A tear slipped down her cheek, not for Edward, but for the innocent life she'd failed to protect. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "This time, I'll make it right." Wiping her tears, Sarah straightened, her grief hardening into resolve. She couldn't change the past, but she could shape the future. Edward and Emily thought her weak, a pawn they could manipulate, but they were wrong. The radiant figure's words, "Rewrite your fate," pulsed in her veins, a reminder of her purpose. She wouldn't confront Edward now. That would be too easy, too reckless. Instead, she'd let him believe she was compliant, let Emily think her smug victory secure. Sarah's plan was forming, a quiet vow to unravel their deceit and expose them to the world they'd fooled. Her first step was distance. She wanted nothing to do with Edward's schemes or Emily's games. The $500 in her pocket was her lifeline, a means to build a life free of their poison. She knew Emily's child wasn't David's, likely Edward's, or perhaps another man's, given Emily's web of lovers. Sarah's warnings had been dismissed in her past life, but now she saw the power in that truth. She wouldn't waste it on Edward's deaf ears. Instead, she'd use it to sow discord, to turn their allies against them. The thought brought a faint smile to her lips, cold and determined. As she neared her home, Sarah's mind raced with possibilities. Edward and Emily were entwined, their affair a ticking bomb she could detonate when the time was right. For now, she'd play the part of the scorned but submissive wife, letting them underestimate her. Her heart ached for the woman she'd been, the one who'd loved Edward unquestioningly, but that ache fueled her strength. She was no longer that Sarah. She was reborn, a survivor forged in loss and betrayal, ready to write a story where justice, not love, would prevail. Sarah Carter's boots crunched against the gravel path leading to her home, the divorce certificate tucked securely in her pocket, its weight a reminder of her first victory. The afternoon sun cast long shadows, mirroring the darkness of her past life's memories, Edward's betrayal, Emily's smug deceit, and the brutal end she and her unborn son had suffered. Yet the radiant figure's command, "Rewrite your fate," burned in her mind, a guiding light that steadied her steps. She was no longer the naive wife who'd begged for Edward's love. She was a strategist, her heart forged in grief and resolve, ready to dismantle the web of lies that had once destroyed her. As she neared her house, a figure caught her eye, a man lurking near her front door, his posture tense, his eyes darting nervously. Sarah's pulse quickened, but not with fear. She recognized him instantly. Sam Tucker, the thug who'd framed her in her past life, his leering face etched into her memory from that night Edward staged her disgrace. Sam's presence here, now, was no coincidence. She'd seen him with Emily in her previous life, their late-night whispers hinting at a connection deeper than friendship. Sarah had suspected Sam might be the father of Emily's child, a theory Edward dismissed with scorn. Now, seeing him skulking about, she knew he was part of their scheme, likely sent to watch her to ensure she remained the compliant ex-wife. Sarah's first instinct was to confront him, to unleash the fury she'd carried across 2 lifetimes. Her hand tightened into a fist, the memory of Sam's role in her downfall, his hands on her in that staged betrayal, igniting a spark of rage. But she paused, her breath steadying. Rage was a weapon, but only if wielded with precision. Confronting Sam now would alert Edward and Emily, tipping her hand too soon. Instead, she saw an opportunity. Sam was a weak link, driven by ego and misplaced loyalty to Emily. If she could exploit that, she could turn her enemies against each other, letting their deceit unravel. Feigning nonchalance, Sarah approached, her expression neutral but her eyes sharp. Sam straightened, a grin spreading across his face, oblivious to the storm within her. "Hey, sis-in-law," he called, his tone mocking. "Where you coming from?" Sarah's lips curved into a faint, calculated smile. She held up the divorce certificate, letting it catch the light. "Where else?" "Divorce court." Sam's eyes lit up, his excitement palpable, but Sarah pressed on, her voice casual, almost conspiratorial. "Edward forced me into it. Says he's got to take care of Emily's baby. I don't see through him, but I know exactly what's happening." Sam blinked, his grin faltering. "What do you mean?" he asked, leaning closer, his curiosity piqued. Sarah's smile widened, cold and deliberate. "Oh, come on, Sam. Edward and Emily are sneaking around behind everyone's backs. They've been at it for months." She paused, watching his face, then drove the knife deeper. "And Emily? She's not just with Edward. There's Zach from the power plant, Kevin from the transit depot, and Lucas from the machine factory. She's got a whole list of men, and no one knows who the baby's father is. It could be yours, Edward's, or someone else's entirely." The effect was immediate. Sam's face drained of color, his jaw tightening as her words sank in. He'd believed he was Emily's one and only, the father of her child, a secret lover she'd chosen above all others. Sarah remembered the whispers from her past life, Sam's devotion to Emily, his willingness to do her bidding, even framing Sarah to avenge Emily's death. The illusion of his special place in Emily's heart was shattered. "You're lying," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction, his eyes betraying a flicker of doubt. Sarah shrugged, her tone light but cutting. "Believe what you want, Sam. However, a woman like Emily doesn't settle for one man. Ask around. You'll see." Sam's hands clenched, his breathing uneven. Sarah could almost hear the gears turning in his mind, his pride warring with the sting of betrayal. She'd planted a seed, one she knew would fester. Sam was no mastermind. He was impulsive, driven by emotion. He'd confront Emily, or worse, Edward, and their fragile alliance would crack under suspicion. Sarah turned toward her door, her heart pounding with triumph and caution. "Good luck, Sam," she said over her shoulder, her voice laced with mock sympathy. "Hope you figure out where you stand." As she stepped inside, the door clicking shut behind her, Sarah leaned against it, her composure giving way to a surge of emotion. Her manipulation of Sam had been a calculated risk, a move to destabilize her enemies, but it stirred memories of her past life's helplessness. She'd been powerless then, a pawn in their game, her warnings ignored, her life stolen. Now, she was the one pulling strings, and the thrill of it was intoxicating. Yet, beneath her resolve, a pang of sorrow lingered, for the woman she'd been, for the son she'd lost, for the trust she'd never reclaim. She pressed a hand to her belly, her voice a whisper. "I'm doing this for us," she said, a vow to the child she carried, a promise to protect them both. Sarah moved to the window, peering out to see Sam storming away, his shoulders hunched, his steps heavy with anger. A faint smile touched her lips. The seed was sown, and soon it would sprout chaos. Edward and Emily thought they'd won, but they'd underestimated her. She wasn't just surviving, she was orchestrating their downfall, step by careful step. The radiant figure's words echoed, "Rewrite your fate," and Sarah felt their truth in her bones. This was her story now, and she would write it with cunning, not tears, her enemies' lies the weapons she'd use to destroy them. Sarah Carter stood in the dim kitchen of her home, the $500 from her divorce tucked safely in her pocket, a tangible symbol of her first step toward freedom. The memory of her past life, Edward's betrayal, the labor camp, her son's fleeting cries, lingered like a shadow, but the radiant figure's command to rewrite your fate burned brighter, guiding her every move. She'd sown discord with Sam Tucker, planting seeds of doubt about Emily's loyalty, and now she braced for the next challenge. Edward and Emily thought her broken, a discarded wife they could manipulate, but Sarah was no longer their pawn. She was a strategist, her heart a fortress of grief and resolve, ready to face them on her terms. The front door creaked open, and Edward entered, his military boots heavy on the floor. Emily clung to his arm, her face pale but her eyes sharp, a predator draped in fragility. The sight of them together, so brazen after the divorce, churned Sarah's stomach, not with jealousy, but with a cold fury. In her past life, she'd been blind to their affair, believing Edward's lies until they destroyed her. Now she saw the truth. Edward's devotion to Emily was a betrayal not just of her but of their unborn child. Her hand brushed her belly, a silent vow to protect her baby from the man who'd once condemned them both. Edward's gaze settled on Sarah, his expression a mix of entitlement and impatience. "Sarah, Emily's anemic. She needs nourishment. Buy a chicken and make her some soup." His tone was commanding, as if she were still his wife and servant. In her past life, Sarah had complied, exhausting her savings to feed his family, while Edward sent his wages to his mother and brother. She'd thought his filial piety noble, but now she knew better. He'd never cared for her, only used her as free labor, a maid to be discarded when Emily beckoned. Sarah's eyes narrowed, her voice steady but laced with defiance. "If you want chicken, Edward, give me the money. I'm not your wife anymore." The words hung in the air, a challenge that made Edward's jaw tighten. He wasn't used to her resistance. She'd never dared ask for anything in her past life. "Can't you cover it?" he snapped, his patience thinning. Sarah crossed her arms, unflinching. "Cover it with what? I've married you for 3 years and you have never given me a cent. Your mother takes every penny for medicine, for food, and now you owe me $500 for child support, as we agreed. Pay it or I'll make sure everyone knows why I'm divorced." Edward's face darkened, but he knew she held the upper hand. If word of his affair with Emily spread, his military career, his pride, would crumble. Grudgingly, he pulled out the $500 and thrust it into her hand, his eyes burning with resentment. Sarah took the money, her pulse steady, but inside, a storm raged. This wasn't just about the cash, it was about power, about proving she wouldn't bend to his will. As Edward stormed out to buy the chicken himself, Emily lingered, her frail act dropping as she fixed Sarah with a venomous glare. "You think you're clever taking his money," Emily hissed, stepping closer. "You're nothing to him, Sarah. Edward loves me, not you." Her voice dripped with smug pride, and then she leaned in, her words a dagger. "On my wedding night with David, I was in Edward's arms. And that baby you're carrying, Edward told me he'll never let it live. Within 3 days, he'll make sure it's gone." The confession hit Sarah like a physical blow, her breath catching as Emily's words echoed Edward's cruelty from her past life. In that life, he'd shown no mercy, framing her, condemning her to the camp where her baby died. Now he planned the same, his heart as ruthless as ever. Sarah's hand trembled, not with fear, but with a surge of rage and sorrow. She pressed it to her belly, the life within her a fragile reminder of what she'd lost and what she fought for. Emily's taunt wasn't just a threat, but a confirmation of Edward's monstrous intent. For a moment, Sarah's vision blurred with tears, the weight of her past life's grief crashing over her. She'd failed her son once, believed Edward's lies, and paid with everything. "Not this time," she whispered, her voice barely audible, a vow to the child she carried. She wouldn't let Edward's cruelty touch them again. Wiping her tears, Sarah met Emily's gaze, her face a mask of calm. "You're proud of that, Emily? Sleeping with your husband's brother on your wedding night? You're filthier than I thought." The words were sharp, calculated to sting, and Emily flinched, her smugness faltering. Sarah turned away, her mind racing. Emily's revelation had clarified her path. Edward's plan to kill her baby was a line he'd crossed, a betrayal that demanded retribution. She wouldn't just escape, she'd destroy them, using their sins against them. As Emily stormed off, Sarah sank into a chair, her heart pounding. The radiant figure's words, "Rewrite your fate," resonated, a call to action she couldn't ignore. She wasn't fighting for Edward's love anymore. She was fighting for justice, her child, and the woman she'd been. Emily's threat had lit a fuse, and Sarah's plan was taking shape. She'd let Edward and Emily think they'd won, let their arrogance blind them. But soon she'd strike, turning their lies into the noose that would hang them both. Sarah Carter sat in the quiet of her living room, the $500 from Edward's grudging payment hidden in a sewn pocket of her dress, a lifeline for the future she was determined to build. The sting of Emily's words, Edward's plan to ensure her baby's death within 3 days, lingered like a bruise on her heart. In her past life, Sarah had been powerless, her trust in Edward leading to her ruin in a brutal labor camp, her son's life snuffed out before it began. Now, reborn with the radiant figure's mandate to rewrite your fate, she was no longer that naive woman. Emily's threat had sharpened her resolve, transforming her grief into a weapon. She would not only survive Edward and Emily's schemes, but dismantle them piece by treacherous piece. The front door slammed open, shattering the silence. Edward's mother, Beatrice Carter, stormed in, her narrow eyes glinting with disdain. Her presence was a familiar torment. Beatrice had always despised Sarah, deeming her unworthy of her son, too plain, too stiff, never sweet enough like Emily. In her past life, Sarah had endured Beatrice's cruelty, giving her money, food, anything to appease her, only to be met with scorn. Those days of submission were over. Sarah's hand rested on her belly, a quiet vow to her unborn child. No one would trample them again. Beatrice's voice was sharp, cutting through the air. "Sarah, I'm sick. I need to go to the provincial hospital. It'll cost $500. Hand it over now." Her demand was brazen, as if Sarah's divorce hadn't changed, as if she were still a servant to the Carter family. The audacity sparked a flicker of rage in Sarah, but she tempered it, her mind racing with strategy. Beatrice wasn't just here for money. She was part of Edward's plan, a vulture circling to ensure Sarah remained subdued. Sarah would have scrambled to comply in her past life, draining her savings to please Beatrice. Now she saw the truth. Beatrice's greed was a weakness, a lever she could pull to assert her power. Sarah rose, her posture straight, her voice calm but edged with steel. "If you need money, Beatrice, ask your son. Or better yet, go to your precious Emily. I'm divorced now. I owe you nothing." The words were a declaration, a line drawn in the sand. Beatrice's face twisted, her cheeks flushing with shock and fury. She wasn't used to defiance, not from Sarah, whom she'd constantly bullied into submission. "You ungrateful wretch!" Beatrice spat, stepping closer, her finger jabbing the air. "How dare you talk back to me? Who do you think you are, demanding $500 from Edward? You're not worth half that." Sarah's eyes narrowed, her heart pounding, but her resolve unshaken. She stepped forward, closing the distance, her voice low and deliberate. "Whether I'm worth it isn't for you to decide. Edward paid me to keep quiet about his affair with Emily. That $500 was hush money, Beatrice, because your son and his lover are terrified I'll tell the world what they've been doing behind everyone's backs." The accusation hit like a slap, and Beatrice's mouth opened, then closed, her bravado faltering. She knew about the affair. Sarah saw it in the flicker of her eyes, the way her lips tightened. Beatrice was complicit, a willing accomplice in Edward's schemes, and Sarah's boldness had caught her off guard. For a moment, Sarah's mind flashed to her past life, to the countless times Beatrice had demeaned her, demanding money while praising Emily's fake smiles. The memory stirred a pang of hurt, not for Beatrice's approval, but for the woman Sarah had been, so desperate to belong to a family that never valued her. She pushed the pain aside, letting it fuel her strength. "If you want to bury your family's dirty secrets, you'll leave me alone," Sarah continued, her voice steady. "One shout from me, the whole neighborhood will know about Edward and Emily by dinner time. Do you want that, Beatrice?" Beatrice's face turned purple, her hands trembling with rage, but she knew Sarah wasn't bluffing. The scandal would ruin Edward's military career, destroy the Carter family's reputation, and crush Beatrice's social standing. She sputtered, her voice shrill. "You're lying! You wouldn't dare!" But the uncertainty in her eyes betrayed her. Sarah held her gaze, unflinching, her heart a mix of triumph and sorrow. Triumph because she'd finally stood up to the woman who'd tormented her. Sorrow because this confrontation was a reminder of the family she'd once longed to please, a family that had never deserved her. Beatrice took a step back, her bravado crumbling. "You'll regret this," she hissed, but her voice lacked conviction. She turned and stomped out, her footsteps echoing her defeat. Sarah exhaled, her body trembling as the adrenaline faded. She sank into a chair, her hand pressing against her belly, where her baby stirred faintly. "We're okay," she whispered, reassuring her child and herself. The confrontation had been a risk, but it was necessary. Beatrice's retreat was a small victory, proof that Sarah could hold her ground, but it also confirmed her enemy's desperation. Edward, Emily, and Beatrice were circling, their plans tightening around her, and Sarah knew she had to stay one step ahead. The radiant figure's words, "Rewrite your fate," echoed in her mind, a reminder of her purpose. Beatrice's visit wasn't just about money, it was a test, a probe to see if Sarah would break. By standing firm, she'd shown them she wasn't the weak link they expected. But Emily's threat about her baby loomed, a dark cloud that spurred Sarah's planning. She couldn't stay passive, waiting for Edward's next move. She'd already turned Sam Tucker against Emily. Now, she must prepare for the larger battle. Her eyes drifted to the window, where the fading light signaled the day's end. The fight was coming, and Sarah Carter was ready to meet it, her heart steeled for the justice she'd claim. Sarah Carter stood in the shadowed hallway of her home, the silence heavy after her confrontation with Beatrice. The $500 from Edward was hidden in her dress, a lifeline for the future she vowed to secure for herself and her unborn child. Emily's chilling words that Edward planned to ensure her baby's death within 3 days echoed in her mind, a stark reminder of the cruelty she'd faced in her past life. Then, Edward had framed her for infidelity, condemning her to a labor camp where her son's life ended before it began. Reborn with the radiant figure's command to rewrite your fate, Sarah was no longer the submissive wife who'd trusted Edward's lies. She was a warrior, her heart a blend of grief and resolve, ready to outmaneuver her enemies. The creak of the front door broke her thoughts. Edward returned, his face tense, followed by Emily, her frail act barely masking her smugness, and Beatrice, her eyes still burning from Sarah's defiance. Their presence together, so soon after Beatrice's failed extortion, sent a prickle of suspicion down Sarah's spine. In her past life, she'd been blind to their collusion, but now she saw the truth. They were a united front, scheming to control her, to erase her and her child from their path. Her hand brushed her belly, a silent promise to protect her baby, no matter the cost. She slipped into the kitchen, pretending to be busy, but her ears strained for their voices. Their whispers carried through the thin walls as they retreated to Emily's room. Sarah's heart pounded, not with fear, but with a cold clarity. She needed to know their plan. Moving silently, she crept to the window outside Emily's room, crouching beneath the sill, the evening air cool against her skin. Beatrice's raspy voice cut through first, sharp with urgency. Sarah knows about you, Emily and Edward. She's squeezing you for money. If we don't stop her, she'll ruin us all. Edward's reply was low, laced with frustration. She's trouble now. I thought she'd stay quiet after the divorce, but she's bolder than I expected. We need to end this, Emily's voice chimed in, eager and venomous. Exactly. She's a threat. We can't let her keep pushing us. We need to take her out before she talks. Sarah's breath caught, her fingers digging into the dirt. The words mirror her past life, when Edward had orchestrated her disgrace with Sam Tucker, destroying her reputation to avenge Emily. But it was Edward's following words that chilled her to the core. I've got a plan. We'll use the same trick as before, a sedative to knock her out, then stage her with a man. Make it look like she's cheating. Tonight, we move. No one will question it after Beatrice spreads the word about her disrespect. The plan was a dagger to Sarah's heart, its familiarity a cruel echo of her past life's betrayal. In that life, she'd woken to Edward's mob, Sam's leering face, and a scandal that branded her a harlot. The memory surged, her screams, the neighbors' disgust, the labor camp's brutality, threatening to drown her. She pressed a hand to her chest, her breathing ragged, tears stinging her eyes. Not for Edward's treachery, but for the innocent life she'd lost, the son whose tiny hand she'd never held. I failed you once, she whispered, her voice trembling. I won't again. The grief was raw, but it fueled her, transforming her pain into a fierce determination. Sarah wiped her tears, her mind sharpening. Edward's plan was a trap, but it was also an opportunity. They thought her weak, a lamb they could slaughter, but she was no longer their prey. The radiant figure's words, "Rewrite your fate," pulsed in her veins, a call to turn their scheme against them. She knew their playbook, the sedative, the staged infidelity, Beatrice's gossip to seal her fate. But this time, she'd be ready, her counterstrike already forming. She'd let them think their plan was working, let their arrogance blind them, then expose their depravity to the world. As she crept back to the kitchen, Sarah's heart raced with fear and exhilaration. Fear because her baby's life hung in the balance, the stakes were higher than ever. Exhilaration because she was no longer reacting, she was orchestrating. She'd already turned Sam Tucker against Emily, sowing chaos in their ranks. Now she'd use Edward's trap to ensnare him and Emily, letting their sins destroy them. Her mind raced through possibilities. The sedative could be swapped, the scene staged in her favor, the neighbors' eyes turned on her enemies instead. Every detail mattered, and Sarah was determined to get it right. Standing by the stove, she feigned normalcy, stirring a pot of water as Edward passed by, his glance dismissive. He thought her oblivious, a pawn in his game, but Sarah's eyes burned with purpose. The memory of her past life's end, her son's faint cries, her fading breath, steeled her resolve. She wasn't fighting for Edward's love anymore. She was fighting for justice, her child, and the woman she'd become. The radiant figure's voice echoed, a steady guide in the storm. This was her moment to shift the tide, to take control of the story that had once broken her. Edward, Emily, and Beatrice were plotting her downfall, but Sarah Carter was ready to rewrite their ending, her every move a step toward the reckoning they deserved. Sarah Carter stood in the dimly lit kitchen, the weight of Edward's plot to frame her. A sedative, a staged infidelity, a public disgrace, burning in her mind. The echoes of her past life, where this same scheme had led to her ruin and her son's death in a labor camp, fueled a fire within her. Emily's threat to ensure her baby's death and Beatrice's complicity confirmed the stakes. Reborn with the radiant figure's command to rewrite your fate, Sarah was no longer the victim who'd trusted Edward's lies. She was a strategist, her heart a crucible of grief and resolve, ready to turn their trap into their undoing. The plan required precision. Sarah had overheard Edward, Emily, and Beatrice scheming to drug her with a sedative, a paralytic that would lock her muscles, leaving her helpless as they staged her with another man. In her past life, she'd woken to Sam Tucker's leering face, a mob led by Edward condemning her. This time, she'd be the one in control. Her first move was to provoke Beatrice, setting the stage for her narrative of victimhood. She knew Beatrice's greed and temper were weaknesses, and Sarah intended to exploit them to justify her later actions. As evening fell, Sarah prepared a chicken Edward had brought, her hands steady but her mind racing. She deliberately carved out the drumsticks, wings, and breast, the best parts, piling them into a bowl for herself. In her past life, she'd always given the choicest pieces to Edward's family, eating scraps to keep the peace. Now, she'd use their entitlement against them. She sat at the table, eating slowly. The rich meat was a small act of defiance. The door slammed open and Beatrice stormed in, her eyes narrowing at the sight of Sarah's feast. "You greedy little wretch!" she shrieked, lunging for the pot. "That's for everyone." Sarah stood, her voice calm but taunting. "I'm not your servant, Beatrice. If you want chicken, cook it yourself." Beatrice's face reddened, her hand swinging towards Sarah. But Sarah was ready, sidestepping swiftly, her foot nudging a stool into Beatrice's path. Beatrice stumbled, crashing face first into the stool with a sickening crack. Blood sprayed as two front teeth flew from her mouth, her howl of pain piercing the air. "You'll pay for this!" she wailed, clutching her bleeding mouth. But Sarah remained unmoved, her heart pounding with a mix of satisfaction and caution. The injury was deliberate, a calculated provocation to paint Beatrice as volatile, setting the stage for Sarah's plan. As Beatrice staggered out, Edward and Emily rushed to her side, and Sarah moved to the next phase. She'd spotted Edward hiding a vial of sedative, a muscle-locking paralytic, in Emily's nightstand earlier. Slipping into Emily's room while they were distracted, she swapped the drug for a harmless powder, her hands steady despite the risk. The real paralytic she hid in her pocket, her plan crystallizing. Emily drank powdered milk every night, a ritual Edward indulged. Sarah opened the milk can, stirring in the powder with paralysis, ensuring it would affect Emily later. The drug would cause temporary muscle rigidity, locking her in place, an ironic twist for Edward's scheme. Returning to the kitchen, Sarah's thoughts turned inward. The radiant figure's words, "Rewrite your fate," echoed, but so did the memory of her past life's end, her son's faint cries, her fading breath. A tear slipped down her cheek, not for fear, but for the weight of her choices. She was fighting for her baby, but the path was ruthless, demanding she become as cunning as her enemies. "I'm doing this for you," she whispered to her unborn child, her hand on her belly, the grief a quiet undercurrent to her resolve. Edward reappeared, his face a mask of false concern, holding a bowl of brown sugar eggs. "Sarah, you must be hungry. I made this for you," he said, his voice gentle but his eyes calculating. Sarah knew the eggs were laced with the fake powder, part of his plan to sedate her. She took the bowl, her expression neutral, and ate every bite, watching his tension ease. "Get some rest," he said, a smug grin tugging at his lips as he left, believing her drugged. Sarah lay on her bed, her pulse racing with anticipation. The trap was set, but not for her. She'd provoked Beatrice, ensuring her outburst would discredit her later. The swapped sedative would leave Emily vulnerable, and Edward's arrogance would close his eyes to the switch. Sarah's plan hinged on timing, letting Edward and Emily think they'd won, then turning their scheme against them. Her heart ached for the innocence she'd lost, the woman who'd loved Edward unquestioningly, but that ache fueled her strength. She wasn't just surviving, she was orchestrating chaos, her enemy's own lies the weapons she'd wield. The radiant figure's voice steadied her, a promise of justice. Tonight, Sarah Carter would shift the game, her every move a step toward the reckoning that awaited. Sarah Carter lay on her bed, her heart pounding as she feigned the effects of Edward's fake sedative, her mind sharp with the plan she'd set in motion. The night was thick with tension, the air heavy with the weight of her enemies' schemes. Edward, Emily, and Beatrice plotting to frame her for infidelity, just as they had in her past life, leading to her and her son's death in a labor camp. Emily's threat to ensure her baby's death had ignited a fire within her, and the radiant figure's command to rewrite your fate guided her every move. Sarah was no longer the naive wife who'd trusted Edward's lies. She was a force, her grief and resolve forged into cunning, ready to turn their trap into their downfall. Her provocation of Beatrice, eating the best chicken parts, causing Beatrice to lose 2 teeth in a rage, had set the stage, painting Beatrice as volatile. She'd swapped Edward's paralytic sedative, which locked muscles rigid, for a harmless powder, lacing Emily's nightly milk with the real drug. Sarah played along when Edward fed her the drugged eggs, eating them to lull him into complacency. Now, the final act was unfolding. Edward, believing her sedated, had left to avoid suspicion, planning to return once his trap was sprung. But Sarah was steps ahead, her plan hinging on exposing Edward and Emily's affair to the neighborhood. She rose silently, slipping to the outhouse where she'd dragged Sam Tucker after knocking him out with a brick when he'd snuck into her room, an accomplice in Edward's scheme. Sam lay unconscious, his role in her past life's disgrace fueling her resolve. She ensured he'd stay out of the way, her hands trembling not with fear, but with the weight of her actions. Returning to the house, she grabbed a rolling pin, her weapon of choice, and moved toward Emily's room. The person with paralysis in Emily's milk would be taking effect, and Sarah knew Edward, unable to resist Emily, would be with her, their arrogance her opportunity. Bursting into Emily's room, Sarah's voice rang out, raw with feigned fury. "Edward Carter, you heartless bastard!" She swung the rolling pin, striking Edward's shoulder as he and Emily, tangled on the bed, froze in shock. The person with paralysis had locked Emily's muscles, her body rigid, trapping Edward in a compromising position. Their eyes widened, panic setting in as Sarah's screams drew neighbors. "You're sleeping with Emily Moore behind my back," she cried, her voice breaking with calculated anguish. "I'm pregnant with your child, and this is how you repay me?" The neighbors, summoned by Beatrice's earlier gossip about Sarah's disrespect, poured in, their gasps filling the room. Edward and Emily, unable to separate due to the paralytic's grip, were a tableau of shame, their affair laid bare. Sarah's performance was flawless, her sobs a mix of genuine grief and strategic theater. "I treated Emily like a sister," she wailed, pointing at Emily's swollen belly. "David's been dead 3 months, but that baby's been growing for 2. It's Edward's." The accusation ignited murmurs, the crowd's outrage turning on Edward and Emily. Sarah's heart raced, not with fear, but with a fierce exhilaration. In her past life, she'd been shamed, her reputation destroyed by Edward's mob. Now, she'd flipped the script, their sins ensnaring them. She glimpsed Beatrice in the doorway, her face pale, her plan to frame Sarah crumbling. Sarah's eyes met hers, a silent challenge, and Beatrice shrank back, her missing teeth a reminder of Sarah's earlier victory. The radiant figure's words, "Rewrite your fate," echoed, validating her triumph. She'd turned their trap into a spectacle, the neighborhood's scorn a noose around Edward and Emily's necks. Yet, beneath her triumph, a pang of sorrow stirred. Sarah's hand rested on her belly, the life within her a reminder of the son she'd lost. This victory was justice, but it came at a cost. Her innocence, her trust, the woman who'd once loved Edward. "I'm doing this for us," she whispered to her unborn child, her voice soft amid the chaos. The crowd's voices rose, condemning Edward and Emily as shameless and vile, their words a chorus of Sarah's vindication. She'd exposed their affair, but this was only the beginning. The paralytic's effects would fade, but the scandal would not, and Sarah was ready to push her plan further, ensuring their ruin was complete. As the neighbors dragged Edward and Emily, still locked together, toward the hospital, Sarah followed, her sobs a mask for her resolve. The radiant figure's voice steadied her, a promise of justice. She'd rewritten this moment, turning her enemy's trap into their disgrace. Edward and Emily thought they'd broken her, but Sarah Carter was unbroken. Her every move was a step toward the awaited reckoning, and her heart was steeled for the battles yet to come. Sarah Carter stood amidst the chaos of her home, the echoes of her screams still ringing as neighbors dragged Edward and Emily, locked together by the paralytic's grip, toward the hospital. The rolling pin lay discarded, her performance as the betrayed wife flawless, the neighborhood's outrage a tidal wave that had engulfed her enemies. In her past life, Edward's scheme to frame her for infidelity had led to her disgrace and death in a labor camp, her son's life snuffed out. Reborn with the radiant figure's command to rewrite your fate, Sarah had turned their trap against them, exposing their affair with devastating precision. Yet, as the crowd's voices faded, a weight settled over her, not of triumph, but of the sacrifice she'd planned next. The scandal had spread like wildfire, the neighbors' whispers, shameless, vile, cementing Edward and Emily's ruin. Pale and toothless Beatrice had fled the scene, her plan to frame Sarah shattered. Sarah's heart raced with a mix of exhilaration and dread. She'd orchestrated their downfall, but Emily's threat, Edward's intent to kill her unborn child, loomed large. He'd shown no mercy in her past life, and she knew he'd try again. To protect herself, to sever all ties to Edward's cruelty, Sarah had made a harrowing choice. She'd taken abortion pills days earlier, ensuring the miscarriage that now gripped her body. The pain was sharp, a physical echo of the grief she carried, but it was necessary. She couldn't bear a child tied to a monster. As cramps seized her, Sarah clutched her belly, collapsing to the floor, her sobs real but calculated. "My baby!" she cried, her voice raw, drawing the neighbors' attention. They rushed to her, their faces etched with sympathy, believing the stress of Edward's betrayal had triggered her loss. Carried to the hospital, Sarah's tears were for the son she'd lost in her past life, for the life she was sacrificing now to ensure her freedom. In the operating room, doctors completed the procedure, their voices gentle, unaware of her premeditation. Sarah lay still, her body aching, her heart torn between necessity and sorrow. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the child she'd never hold, her voice breaking. This was the only way. The hospital buzzed with gossip, and the scandal of Edward and Emily was drawing crowds. Sarah, recovering in her room, felt the weight of her actions. The radiant figure's words, "Rewrite your fate," had guided her, but this sacrifice tested her resolve. She'd protected herself, but at what cost? The grief was a quiet storm, mingling with the fierce pride of her victory. She'd turned Edward's trap into their disgrace, but the loss of her baby, even planned, carved a new scar on her soul. Yet, she couldn't waver. Edward and Emily were down, but not out, and she needed to ensure their ruin was permanent. Gathering her strength, Sarah slipped to a hospital phone, her hands trembling as she dialed the military's complaint hotline. "I'm reporting Major Edward Carter," she said, her voice steady despite her pain. "He's engaged in inappropriate conduct, moral corruption, and violated military discipline with his affair with his sister-in-law, Emily Moore." The officer's tone was grave, promising an immediate investigation. Sarah hung up, a quiet satisfaction settling over her. Edward's career and pride would crumble under the weight of his actions, just as he'd once destroyed her. Returning to her room, Sarah sank onto the bed, her body weak but her spirit unbroken. The neighbors' sympathy, the military's scrutiny, and the town's outrage were her weapons, forged by her cunning. Yet alone in the sterile room, she allowed herself a moment of vulnerability. Her hand rested where her baby had been, and tears fell silently. In her past life, she'd been powerless, her love for Edward blinding her to his cruelty. Now she was rewriting her story, but the path was ruthless, demanding sacrifices she'd never imagined. "I did this for us," she murmured, a vow to her lost children, a promise to live for them. The radiant figure's voice echoed, a steady guide through her grief. She'd exposed Edward and Emily, reported Edward to the military, and protected herself from his threat. The scandal was a fire she'd ignited, and it would burn until her enemies were ashes. But the cost, her baby, her innocence, weighed heavily. Sarah wiped her tears, her resolve hardening. She wasn't done. Edward, Emily, and Beatrice would face more consequences, and she'd ensure every step of their fall. The radiant figure's mandate was her strength, and Sarah Carter was ready to write the next chapter, her heart steeled for the justice she'd claim. Sarah Carter lay in her hospital bed, the sterile air heavy with the weight of her orchestrated triumph. The scandal she'd unleashed, catching Edward and Emily in their shameful affair, locked together by the person with paralysis she'd slipped into Emily's milk, had consumed the town. Her planned miscarriage, a painful but necessary sacrifice to sever ties with Edward's cruelty, had earned her the neighbors' sympathy, cementing her as the wronged wife. In her past life, Edward's scheme to frame her for infidelity had led to her death in a labor camp, her son's life stolen. Reborn with the radiant figure's command to rewrite your fate, Sarah had turned their trap against them, her grief and resolve forging a path to justice. The hospital buzzed with gossip, the scandal drawing crowds eager to witness Edward and Emily's disgrace. Doctors had separated them, but the damage was done. Edward, his military career in jeopardy after Sarah's report to the complaint hotline, faced an investigation that moved swiftly. By morning, word came. He'd been dishonorably discharged, his title stripped, his pride shattered. Sarah overheard nurses whispering. He wailed when they told him, then passed out. The news brought a quiet satisfaction, but her heart ached for the cost. Her baby, innocence, the woman she'd been before Edward's betrayal. Emily's fate was grimmer. The paralytic's effects had faded, but the scandal's toll was permanent. Seeing Edward and Emily had betrayed Sam Tucker's family stormed the hospital. They cornered Emily, their rage unleashed in a brutal beating that caused a massive hemorrhage. She lost her baby and, due to complications, her uterus, ensuring she'd never bear children again. Hearing this from a sympathetic neighbor, Sarah felt a complex stir of emotions, vindication and a flicker of pity for the woman who'd chosen deceit over decency. Yet Emily's suffering was her own, a consequence Sarah had engineered with cold precision. Beatrice, Edward's mother, faced her reckoning. Furious about Sam's role in the failed scheme, the Tuckers hadn't spared her. Bruised and humiliated, Beatrice's social standing crumbled, her role in the plot to frame Sarah exposed by the neighbors' gossip. Sarah learned from Auntie Jang, a kind neighbor visiting her, that Beatrice was now a pariah, shunned by the community she'd once lorded over. "She's got nowhere to go," Auntie Jang said, shaking her head. "Lives in a shack now, begging for scraps. Serves her right for backing Edward's filth." The news was a final nail in Beatrice's coffin, her greed and cruelty rewarded with isolation. Discharged from the hospital, Sarah returned home, her body weak but her spirit fierce. She found Beatrice in the kitchen, cooking as if nothing had changed, her face haggard, bruises mottling her skin. "You black-hearted wretch!" Beatrice snarled, pointing a trembling finger. "You dare come back? I'll make you pay!" Her voice was shrill, but Sarah saw only a broken woman, her power gone. Rage surged, not just for Beatrice's cruelty, but for the family that had never valued her. Sarah grabbed Beatrice's hair, yanking her toward the door. "This is my house," she roared, her voice raw. "Get out, or I'll beat you when you show your face." Beatrice stumbled, blood dripping from her nose, her screams echoing, as Sarah tossed her out like refuse. The neighbors, drawn by the commotion, watched in silence, their sympathy firmly with Sarah. She showed them the divorce certificate and her parents' deed to the house, proving her claim. The police, called by Beatrice, arrived but sided with Sarah, knowing her as the victim of Edward's scandal. They escorted Beatrice away, warning her to stay clear. Sarah stood tall, her heart pounding with triumph and sorrow. Beatrice's defeat was justice, but it stirred memories of her past life's longing for a family's love, a longing she'd buried. Sarah sank into a chair, her hand on her empty belly. The radiant figure's words, "Rewrite your fate," had guided her, but the path was brutal. She'd destroyed Edward, Emily, and Beatrice, but the loss of her baby, even planned, weighed heavily. Tears fell, not for her enemies, but for the innocence she'd sacrificed, the mother she'd never be in this moment. Yet her resolve held firm. She'd rewritten her story, turning her enemies' sins against them. The town's scorn, the military's judgment, and the Tuckers' vengeance were her doing, a testament to her cunning. Sarah's eyes drifted to the horizon, where dawn broke. The radiant figure's voice steadied her, a promise of freedom. Edward was ruined, Emily barren, Beatrice a beggar. Her enemy's downfall was complete. But Sarah knew cornered dogs could bite. She'd need to leave to build a life beyond their reach to protect herself. Her heart, scarred but unbroken, yearned for peace, for a future where her children's memory could live in her strength. The battle was won, but the war wasn't over. Sarah Carter was ready to write her final chapter, her every step a defiance of the past that had tried to break her. Sarah Carter stood in the doorway of her home, the weight of her victory over Edward, Emily, and Beatrice, tempered by the scars of her sacrifices. The scandal she'd orchestrated, exposing their affair with a paralytic-laced trap, had ruined them, her planned miscarriage a painful necessity to escape Edward's threat to her unborn child. In her past life, their schemes had led to her death in a labor camp, her son's life stolen. Reborn with the radiant figure's command to rewrite your fate, Sarah had turned their betrayal into their downfall, her grief and resolve forging a path to justice. Now with Edward dishonorably discharged, Emily barren, and Beatrice a shunned beggar, Sarah knew she couldn't stay. Cornered enemies could retaliate, and she craved a life free of their poison. She made a swift decision: sell everything and leave. The house, her parents' legacy, and her factory job were priced low, 3,000 yuan for the home, 1,000 for the job. Buyers snapped them up within days, the 4,000 yuan a seed for her future. Packing a single bag, Sarah bought a train ticket south, to a city pulsing with reform and opportunity. As the train pulled away, she pressed a hand to her empty belly, tears falling for the children she'd lost, her son in her past life, her baby in this one. "I'll live for you," she whispered, her voice soft but fierce. The radiant figure's words echoed, a promise of redemption, and Sarah felt a flicker of hope beneath her sorrow. The southern city was a whirlwind of possibility, but success wasn't instant. Sarah rented a cramped room, her savings dwindling as she navigated the bustling markets. She taught herself to sew, burning midnight oil over borrowed books, her fingers calloused from practice. Starting with a street stall, she sold simple dresses, her designs catching eyes despite early losses to savvy competitors. Her persistence paid off. Within a year, she opened a small shop, and her grit and knack for trends built a loyal clientele. By the third year, her brand was born, with multiple storefronts and a reputation for quality. Sarah, once a betrayed wife, was now a businesswoman, her success a testament to her unyielding will. One late autumn evening, a familiar voice called her name as Sarah left a restaurant. "Sarah Carter?" She turned to see Auntie Jiang, the neighbor who'd shown her kindness during her darkest days. Older and heavier, Auntie Jiang's face lit with joy. "You've made it big, haven't you? You look radiant." Sarah smiled, warmth flooding her at the sight of a friendly face. Over dinner, she offered Auntie Jiang a job at her store, grateful for past kindness. Auntie Jiang shared news from their old town as they ate, a grim epilogue to Sarah's revenge. Edward, expelled from the military and blind in one eye, had slunk back to his hometown with Beatrice, who lived out her poor days, shunned for her role in the scandal. Humiliated and jobless, Edward turned violent, abusing Beatrice in his rage. Desperate, he sought Emily, believing she owed him for his sacrifices. But Emily, now a pariah, scorned him, revealing her baby had been Sam Tucker's, not his, and that she'd used Edward's status for comfort. Devastated, Edward begged her to stay, but Emily chose Sam, whose family demanded she care for him after his injuries. Edward, consumed by betrayal, returned months later with a pig-slaughtering knife. He killed Emily and Sam in a bloody frenzy, their deaths staining the town's memory. Arrested and sentenced to death, Edward was executed by firing squad within 6 months. Sarah listened, her fork still, her heart mixed with vindication and quiet sorrow. Edward's end was fitting, his cruelty turned inward. But the violence stirred memories of her past life's pain, her son's death, her despair. "I knew he was capable of this," she said softly, her voice steady. "That's why I left." Auntie Jiang nodded, her eyes kind. "You were smart, Sarah. You escaped a monster." The words were a balm, easing the ache of her sacrifices. Sarah had rewritten her fate for revenge, freedom, and a life untainted by her enemy's darkness. That night, under the southern stars, Sarah stood outside her shop, the city's hum contrasting with her inner calm. The radiant figure's voice, "Rewrite your fate," felt fulfilled, a guide that had led her from betrayal to triumph. Her business thrived, her heart opened to new possibilities, perhaps love one day with someone worthy. The grief for her lost children remained, a quiet companion, but it no longer defined her. She was Sarah Carter, survivor, creator, a woman who'd turned her pain into power. As the stars shone, she smiled, ready to embrace the happiness she'd earned, her past a distant shadow, her future a canvas